joining us tonight. Throughout the year, we have been delving into the 19th century. We've been examining the role of the Bethlehem Iron Company in shaping our region. John Fritz, the first superintendents of the works, along with Robert Sayre, Joseph Wharton, and others, have set the stage for the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, which flourished in the early and middle part of the 20th century. We're going to learn more about that progress tonight. So it is my honor to introduce Bob Bilheimer. Coming from a Bethlehem Steel family whose heritage spreads over a century, Bob joined Bethlehem Steel as a member of the Laude Management Training Course in 1981. He spent his entire career at Bethlehem Steel in public affairs, primarily in government and community affairs and corporate communications. In the early 90s, he served as Director of Public Affairs at Bethlehem's Burns Harbor Division in Indiana. And in 1998, he returned to Bethlehem as General Manager of Public Affairs. As General Manager, he was responsible for corporate communications, including oversight of the Schwab Memorial Library, where he served as the last editor of Bethlehem Steel's renowned corporate magazine, the Bethlehem Review. Bob is a graduate of Gettysburg College with a BA in Business Administration. He holds an MBA from Lehigh University. And for decades, he has studied the American steel industry and is an expert on Bethlehem Steel corporate history. Here today, Bob is the General Manager of the Industrial Archives and Library. So please join me in welcoming Bob Bilheimer.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that really kind introduction. And it's really my pleasure to be here tonight to see all of you, many familiar faces, people that I actually worked with over the years. I'm an old guy, as you can tell, and I've had a long career at Bethlehem Steel. Maybe not quite as long as I wanted, but that wasn't totally in my control. But it really is my pleasure to be here. And thank you, Kara, and thank you, Andrew, again for having me here tonight. We're going to talk about the rise of Bethlehem Steel. I think so many times, those of us from Bethlehem especially, kind of think about Bethlehem Steel kind of as it always was there. It wasn't always there. And, we kind of think of Bethlehem in its declining years and going down and finally failing. Well, it wasn't always like that. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to celebrate that story of Bethlehem Steel's success from 1904 to roughly 1945, which was the time when Bethlehem Steel really flourished in in my terminology, stepped onto the world stage. It started out as a single plant company, obviously right here on this site in eastern Pennsylvania, and rose into one of the largest and most influential industrial behemoths really in the entire world. Just before I start to talk, I'd just like to do a kind of quick survey here. How many former employees do we have in the audience, either corporate or plant or whatever? Okay, keep your hands up, Now, how many people had a parent or a close relative that was an employee? Okay, how many people had a neighbor or another further, somewhere in their neighborhood that was an employee? Right. I mean, I could keep going with this. The point is, I used to make this talk in the Bethlehem schools, and I would go through that exercise. And even today, almost every hand in the room goes up after I do that. And, that's for obvious reasons. But one of the really important things I think about this talk is that as time goes on, fewer and fewer hands are going to go up in the room. And those stories that I'm going to celebrate today are going to be lost to history. So this is my way of trying to memorialize and celebrate that. That's number one. Number two, and I already alluded to this, we all have kind of a Bethlehem-centric view of Bethlehem Steel, myself included. My father was an assistant superintendent here at the local plant. My mother was a receptionist on the plant patrol during World War II. My grandmother was a metallurgical inspector in 1918 for World War I. My brothers worked in the mills. Summers, I never had a chance to do that. And I even had an uncle who was on the Bethlehem Steel Board of Directors through a weird twist of fate. So I come from a Bethlehem family just like you. But the downside of that is that I kind of have that Bethlehem blinders on too, that I kind of, growing up especially, had no clue what happened outside of Bethlehem. Most of Bethlehem Steel was elsewhere. And this story that I'm going to tell you today is about the elsewhere. And so I think that's an important thing as time goes on. It's to help educate people here in this area that this company had a huge influence beyond the Lehigh Valley. Third, Bethlehem Steel is a great company. Let's make no mistake about that. Again, we kind of think about the decline and the fall of Bethlehem Steel, but Bethlehem Steel is a great company. And it had an influence that went far beyond the steel industry. If you think Bethlehem Steel was just another steel company, you're wrong. It was a paragon of American industry, and it had influence, transcendent influence, beyond the steel industry. After all, it provided a pathway for poor immigrant families to have a clear path to the middle class. It educated their children. It gave them health insurance. It gave them a pension. It changed our society in ways that went way beyond the institution itself. And back when Bethlehem Steel was thriving, it was one of those few companies that you can count on one hand that had an influence on society and really made a mark on the world. Companies like General Motors and Ford, Standard Oil, and Bethlehem Steel is in that group. And not only because it was big, but because it was influential in so many of these other ways. And so that's a story that I think it needs to be celebrated. And that's what I'm here to do tonight. And hopefully I can open your eyes to some of the things that went on beyond the Lehigh Valley. And again, it's my honor and my privilege to be here to tell you that story tonight. So we'll just jump right in here. And as I said, this is the rise of Bethlehem Steel, 1904 to 1945. Uh-oh. Gotta turn this on. In my view, there were 6 major influences or events or game changers, if you will, that helped transform this single plant company into the behemoth that it became really less than 2 generations after that. 6 different events. And if you have really good eyesight, you might be able to have kind of a spoiler alert here, and you can see kind of where I'm going on this talk. But each one of these events or these game changers contributed to Bethlehem Steel becoming the company that it was. And without any one of those, my contention is that this company would not have ended up where it was in 1945. There it is, 1904. It was a single plant, the Bethlehem plant of Bethlehem Steel Company. It was Steel Company in those days. It was not a corporation. It became Bethlehem Steel Company in 1899, but it was not the corporation yet. And they had iron mines in Laude, Cuba. That was the company. One plant, iron mines in Cuba. So let's fast forward here a little bit to where we are going to end up, and then we'll work backwards. This is Bethlehem Steel in 1945. Now, this is just roughly 40 years later. Eugene Grace was the chairman. Art Homer was the president. It was the second largest steelmaker in the world. It was the largest shipbuilder in the world. How many people knew that Bethlehem Steel was even a shipbuilder, let alone the largest shipbuilder in the world? Okay. It was the largest steel fabricator in the world as well, in terms of capacity. It had 9 steel plants from coast to coast, 10 shipyards on both coasts, and 2 years after this, they also acquired the Beaumont shipyard in Beaumont, Texas. 10 fabricating works, 5 other manufacturing plants, over $1 billion in assets. That's in 1944. $1.3 billion in total revenue. Let me tell you, folks, in 1945, that was a lot of money. And still a lot of money today. And over 200,000 employees. And actually, this is 1944. At its height in 1943, Bethlehem Steel had 300,000 employees. And the interesting thing is, 180,000 of those were in shipbuilding, only 120,000 in steelmaking. So really, in some ways, Bethlehem Steel was actually a larger shipbuilder than it was a steelmaker. And it was the second largest steelmaker in the world. Had a capacity of 11.8 million net tons, dozens of iron ore, limestone, and other raw material properties, 7 subsidiary railroads, there you go, Mike, 7 ore carrying and cargo carrying vessels, 9 Great Lakes ore carriers, and they had partial interest in 5 others, 43 domestic sales offices, and 46 offices and agents around the world. Just an amazing company, 1945. But let's talk about the first chapter. You really can't talk about Bethlehem Steel Corporation without talking about this guy, Charles Schwab. Not only is he the founder of the company, but his fingerprints are all over everything that I'm going to talk about today. And I would say the single number one factor in Bethlehem Steel's rise to prominence was Charles Schwab. The guy was an industrial genius. He really was. And he had an amazing personality. But he put together this corporation and guided it until his death in 1939. he was, check my notes here. Schwab he was a force in the industry. He was a leader in the industry. He was getting gregarious. He was flamboyant. He was a ladies' man. He was a gambler, but he was also an industrial genius. And he knew how to read people. He knew how to read people. He knew how to, find the right person for the right job. He was an absolute expert in that. He also understood the art of the deal. I don't want to bring politics into this too much, but he was kind of very much Trumpian in his aspect and how he looked at the job. He knew opportunities. He was an innovator, and he wasn't afraid to take a risk to do that. Risk-taking, innovator, those are words that you didn't hear about Bethlehem Steel at the end, did you? But back then, he was it. You have to understand Schwab, you have to understand his life, and he had an extraordinary life. And there he is on the cover of Harper's Weekly as a young man. He was born in 1862 in Blair County, PA, near Altoona. Shortly thereafter, his family moved to Laredo, Pennsylvania. That's in Cambridge County. He attended San Francisco College. He excelled in physics and math and engineering, although he only attended school until he was 17 years old. He went off to find his fame and fortune in Braddock, Pennsylvania. And his first job was as a day clerk at the McDivitt General Store in Braddock. Now, those of you who know a little bit about the steel industry, Braddock, of course, was the home of the famous Edgar Thomson Steel Works. And that was adjacent to the McDivitt store. It wasn't too long before Charlie captured the attention of a legendary steelman who was the superintendent at Edgar Thomson, Captain Bill Jones. And at age 17, he didn't stay in the general store too long. At age 17, he got a job in the engineering department at Edgar Thomson Steel Works. Keep in mind, he only had 17 years of schooling and not a whole lot of engineering. His pay was $1 a day. Changed a little bit later. At age 19, he became the chief engineer of the plant just 2 years later. He married Raina Dinky. They called her Raina or Rainy. She was he was a boarder in their home. She was several years his senior, but they fell in love and they got married in 1883. They were married for 55 years until she died in 39, just before he died. They were childless, although Charlie, he fathered at least one child out of wedlock during that time period, but they never had any together. And she seemed to tolerate his infidelity. So it was a real partnership. I think they really did love each other in their own special way. And so it was a really interesting partnership. But at age 25, he's now general superintendent of the Homestead Works, which is, again, another one of the legendary early steelworks in this country. Still in operation too, I think, right, Mike? Is Homestead still? No, that's right. It's long gone. But anyway, age 25, general superintendent. Age 27, he's appointed the general superintendent of the Edgar Thomson Works because Captain Bill Jones had a tragic wheel accident and died. He got the top job. Age 27. At 35, he was named president of Carnegie Steel. This is the largest steel company in America at the time. Just a 35-year-old young man. They called him the boy president, and he was on his way up, but still not done yet. At age 39, he actually became the first president of U.S. Steel. And it's an interesting story. J.P. Morgan, of course, the famous financier, wanted to put together U.S. Steel and needed to approach Andrew Carnegie, who was the major steel maker at the time, and had to kind of lure him into retirement and to buy him out. He sent Schwab to do that. Schwab, of course, was Carnegie's lieutenant. And it was a very careful negotiation, but Schwab pulled it off and convinced Carnegie that, okay, Carnegie would actually sell the company to J.P. Morgan, put together U.S. Steel. And of course, Carnegie in those days wanted to go out and kind of maybe be a philanthropist. He was kind of done with the steel industry, so it was good timing. The price was $400 million, a tremendous amount of money back then. It easily made Carnegie the richest man in America, maybe even in the world. And of course, then he went on to endow libraries all around the country and did a lot of philanthropy. But U.S. Steel was born out of that transaction, which Schwab actually brokered between the two gentlemen. And at age 39, he He's president of the first $1 billion corporation. It sounds funny today, doesn't it? $1 billion, but back then it was huge. And U.S. Steel was the first $1 billion corporation. And he began construction of his residence in New York City. There it is. It was called Riverside. I put it in here because it's an amazing story in and of itself. I mean, this is the most opulent and largest private residence in the history of New York City. It was on the Upper West Side. It had, well, it was just a palace. And he started construction in 1901 after he became president of U.S. Steel. And it was just an amazing structure. After he died in 1939, it's a sad story. I don't want to get ahead of my story, but he passed away and he died penniless. He had $300,000 in debt. He had already gotten rid of Riverside. They tore it down, amazingly, and it became an apartment complex called Schwab House, appropriately. You can still see it today, but Riverside is gone. Now, in 1901, while he was still president of U.S. Steel, he purchased Bethlehem Steel Company as a private investment, just on his own, on his own accord. Had nothing to do with U.S. Steel. Some people say, "Oh, Bethlehem was once a subsidiary of U.S. Steel." That's not true. Bethlehem was a personal possession of Charlie Schwab, and he did that in 1901. But immediately after he got Bethlehem, J.P. Morgan and Judge Gary didn't think it was real appropriate for Schwab to have his own private investment in another steel company and then be president of U.S. Steel. So he convinced J.P. Morgan to take Bethlehem Steel off his hands. And so Morgan purchased Bethlehem Steel from Schwab. And so for a time, J.P. Morgan held Bethlehem Steel as his own private investment. But why Bethlehem? Why did Schwab purchase Bethlehem in the first place? Well, that brings us to the second major factor. And if you haven't been across the hall to visit the John Fritz exhibit, please do so. It's just a fabulous exhibit that the museum has put together here. It tells the story in much, much more detail than I'm going to go into tonight, obviously, about the Bethlehem Iron Company, about John Fritz. But I think Schwab thought, Bethlehem is this gem, really a niche manufacturer of heavy ordnance and forgings, and had a real place in the marketplace. And he recognized the importance of the Bethlehem plant, really, and that niche that the Bethlehem plant, the Bethlehem Iron Company, occupied. But Fritz was an amazing guy too. And to understand how Bethlehem came to occupy this niche in the marketplace, you have to understand what was going on in the United States during the late 1800s. After the Civil War, the U.S. Navy became very small, very antiquated. It was wooden warships. It was not up to date at all. But by the 1880s and 1890s, the U.S. Navy was moving to steel ships, and steel was the material of choice. And the U.S. had to play catch-up. John Fritz was a real visionary. He understood that if the United States is going to go towards steel ships, they need a heavy forger to be able to make the armor plate, to make the ordnance, to make the guns. And so he convinced the Bethlehem Iron Company management, somewhat reluctantly, by the way. It took a little while, but he's able to get Sarah and company to agree to take the risk and move out of rail production. Well, not move out of rail production, but in addition to rail production, switch to ordnance. And so Bethlehem became sort of the go-to institution as far as heavy guns, armor plate, and the like. And so this is really, many historians credit the birthplace of the modern American defense industry as being right here in Bethlehem, at the Bethlehem plant, because of what they did. It was the first heavy forger in this country, and it actually, you can still cross the Mincy Trail Bridge and look up and you can see Lehigh Heavy Forge. And that's the last vestiges of this function that Bethlehem did here at the Bethlehem plant. And even though we don't make steel here anymore, Lehigh Heavy Forge still makes heavy forgings, and they're the only ones left in the country that do that. So that's the legacy that Fritz started back in the late 1900s. And part of it also is that he understood that there was going to be some really beneficial peacetime uses for those kind of facilities as well. So Bethlehem became a heavy forger and made all sorts of amazing pieces. down the lower left, that's actually a tunnel section for the Holland Tunnel. In addition to that, they forged the centerpiece, the center split, or the center hub of the Great Ferris Wheel, the first Ferris Wheel, 1892, 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Bethlehem forged that piece in the Ferris Wheel. And at that time, it was the largest single piece ever forged in this country. And Bethlehem did it right here at the Bethlehem plant. So heavy forging and ordnance is where Bethlehem laid its claim. And so that's where really the Bethlehem story here started. I think it's pretty aptly stated by this fellow, Lieutenant Colonel William Hope. He was a British officer, a noted ordnance expert, artillery expert, and he visited Bethlehem. And when he returned to England, he said, "I consider the Bethlehem gun plant to be superior to any gun plant in the world." So already Bethlehem is starting to be noticed, even on the world stage, starting to take those first couple steps up onto that world stage. And that was back before Charlie Schwab came on the scene. Now, factor number 3, shipbuilding. Shipbuilding? I tell people about shipbuilding in Bethlehem, and they give me this kind of blank, kind of incredulous look, like, what are you talking about? You can't build ships on the Lehigh River. Well, obviously they weren't making ships on the Lehigh River, but they made a heck of a lot of ships elsewhere. And so Bethlehem, really in some ways, and we'll see this in the story as I go forward, Bethlehem was really almost a shipbuilder first. It was even a steelmaker. I'm talking about the corporation. Of course, the Bethlehem plant was in existence here, and the Bethlehem Steel Company. But it was a shipbuilder. And I call it Bethlehem Steel's dimension of differentiation. It really was, and still to this day, there's no major steelmaker, not in this country, that was ever a shipbuilder as well. And I think Schwab understood that, if we can make the ordnance, the heavy guns, if we can make the armor plate, we just make the whole ship. We'll have an outlet for our steel products, and we'll just do the whole thing. And so that's why shipbuilding, he went in the shipbuilding direction. And in 1902, he's still president of U.S. Steel, by the way. But he was instrumental in founding the United States Shipbuilding Company. And the United States Shipbuilding Company had a bunch of shipyards on the east and west coast. He helped form that. Now, it was always kind of a shaky company. It was undercapitalized. And people said that maybe he set it up to fail, but he helped set up the U.S. Shipbuilding Company. And in 1902, he convinced J.P. Morgan to sell Bethlehem Steel Company back to him. And he offered Bethlehem Steel Company to the new United States Shipbuilding Corporation and merged it into U.S. Shipbuilding. So that's why I say, there was actually a U.S. Shipbuilding Corporation before there was a Bethlehem Steel Corporation. And so it was this kind of weird amalgamation of the Bethlehem Steel Company, one plant, the Uragua iron mines, and U.S. Shipbuilding. But it was the tail that wagged the dog. Because let's face it, folks, this was the most important asset that company had. They had these kind of stray shipyards on both coasts. But this was the main thing. But the United States Shipbuilding was controlled by other interests. And so it was the tail that wagged the dog, and it didn't really work. And like I said, some people charged Schwab that, okay, he set it up to fail, because he also set it up so that if it did fail, he would gain control of the whole thing. In 1903, Schwab resigns under pressure from U.S. Steel. He was a gambler. He was in Monte Carlo. Some of the bosses at U.S. Steel just didn't think it was appropriate for him to be out gambling and doing the things that Charlie Schwab did. Even though, like I said, he was a real steelman. He understood steel probably better than anyone else in the world. And that's why people would tend to underestimate Charlie Schwab, because they thought of him as this flamboyant kind of real dealer. But he was a real steelman. And what he really didn't like at U.S. Steel is that U.S. Steel is controlled by financiers. And he wanted to have total control of the company. He wanted to have his own hand in managing the affairs of U.S. Steel, and he didn't get that. So he left, and he left kind of in a huff. At the time, he said, I'm going to go out and build a bigger and better U.S. Steel. And of course, he seized upon what he'd already started here with the United States Shipbuilding with the Bethlehem plant, the Bethlehem Steel Company. And he takes total control, and he puts together the modern Bethlehem Steel Corporation. This is in December of 1904. He's gone from U.S. Steel. U.S. shipbuilding has failed, and he merges the United States Shipbuilding Company into the new Bethlehem Steel Corporation. And so Bethlehem Steel Corporation was born on December 10th, 1904. They had their first board meeting in January of 1905. Schwab was elected chairman, and they were off and running. This was the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, still the single steel plant. 8 shipbuilding and ship repair yards. Harlan and Hollingsworth in Willington, Delaware. The Union Iron Works in San Francisco, California, a storied and famous shipyard on the West Coast, the oldest shipyard on the West Coast. They produced some of those ships that you saw in that earlier drawing. They produced the USS Olympia, which was Admiral Dewey's flagship at the Battle of Manila Bay. They produced the battleship Oregon, which was Teddy Roosevelt's, or McKinley's Bulldog, they call it, famous U.S. ship. But that was done at the Union Iron Works. That was a real important part of the early Bethlehem Steel Corporation. Samuel and Lauren Sons in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the Crescent Shipyard, which is attached to it, and other odds and ends that came with the United States shipbuilding deal. They quickly jettisoned these operations on this list, except for the Crescent Shipyard. That was adjacent to the war plant. And so they jettisoned those, and Bethlehem Steel was on its way. All the pieces are now in place. It was the Bethlehem Steel Company, the single plant, the 8 shipyards, which they divested of 4 right after that, and of course the Urago iron mines in Cuba. So that's in 1905. And so the Bethlehem Steel Corporation was ready to take the next steps up onto that world stage. But enter Eugene Grace. You can't talk about Bethlehem either. Not just Schwab, but you can't talk about Bethlehem Steel without talking about Eugene Gifford Grace. If there was a Mount Rushmore of Bethlehem Steel, Schwab is head number 1, and Eugene Grace is head number 2. And his influence actually went longer than Schwab, which we'll get to. But Grace is a really interesting character in and of himself. He was born 14 years after Schwab, Goshen, New Jersey, from Cape May County. Graduates from Lehigh University in 1899, and interestingly, if you look up in the upper right-hand corner, that's Eugene Grace. He was a star baseball player, and so was his brother, who's sitting down there. Grace was actually offered a contract by the Boston Braves to play professional baseball, which he turned down. I wonder if the world would be a lot different if he had played baseball for the Boston Braves. But he decided he would graduate from Lehigh as an engineer. He joins Bethlehem as a crane operator here at the local plant. Started literally at the bottom. His pay was $1.80 a day, a little bit more than Schwab. But that was his beginning. But Grace couldn't be held back. He immediately emerged from the pack. And by 1902, 3 years later, he's superintendent of yards and transportation. So they had already recognized that there was something special with Eugene Grace. In 1906, Schwab started noticing this young engineer and sent him down to the iron mines in Cuba to straighten them out. He went down to Cuba, straightened out the iron mines. When he came back later in 1906, he was named general superintendent of both the plant. So from 1999 as a crane operator to 1906, in just 7 years, he's the general superintendent. In 1908, Schwab gave him a really pivotal role, and that is overseeing the construction of the grade mill. Now, I'm talking to a Bethlehem crowd here, so everybody kind of knows what the grade mill is all about, but I'll explain it in a little bit here to you in a minute. But it's the mill that made America, because it's the mill that allowed Bethlehem to produce the wide flange beam, which is number 4 of our factors. The wide flange beam changed everything. It changed everything. A quick little lesson here. That's not an I-beam, by the way. Everybody says, oh, it's the Bethlehem I-beam. No, that's an H section, H-beam. The Bethlehem beam, the thing that's rolled on the grade mill, was an H-beam. And if you see the top and the bottom parts were called the flange, the middle part is called the web, and the flange is very, very wide, the wide flange beam, hence the name wide flange beam. But in 1908, nobody in the world produced that product. Nobody knew how to do it. Schwab, again, the innovator that he was, heard about this gray mill process over in Europe that was untried, uncommercialized. And he literally bet the entire company on that process, that he could make that work in Bethlehem. They said, Charlie, you're crazy. That's never going to work. Well, it did work. And you can see, of course, the reason why the Bethlehem Steel wide flange beam became the corporate symbol is because the whole company changed at that point. And he was really shrewd because, you know, he knew that Bethlehem had the shipbuilding capability, had the ordnance capability, guns. It was kind of all in that military basket. They had, of course, a heavy forging capability as well, but he was concerned that there was no peacetime products in the portfolio other than rail. And that's why he seized upon the wide flange beam as Bethlehem's innovation. And overnight, it's a great quote. He told his boys, as he called them, boys, if we're going to go bust, we're going to go bust big, because he leveraged the whole company to do this. 1910, he personally negotiated a contract with Gimbel's department store in New York City, which they were in the process of building their flagship store in downtown New York, Manhattan. And he convinced them to buy the wide flange beam. And you can see they marketed the hell out of it. It actually says there are 12,000 tons. It's a Bethlehem Steel, but it was a high-profile project. And again, Schwab, ever the marketer, was able to leverage that, get a lot of attention for what he did at Gimbel's. And almost overnight, the age of the skyscraper was born. You need wide flange beams to go really high in the sky, because a wide flange beam, it's lighter and it's stronger, better than standard structural shapes, and you can go higher with it. So with the advent of the wide flange beam, you could do skyscrapers. And of course, there's the iconic picture, which you can see right out here in the lobby. Those guys they're actually posing to that picture. It's kind of really happened like that, but it's called Lunch Atop a Skyscraper. And that particular skyscraper, I don't know if that's that picture or not, but that's the GE building, the RTA building. It's the 30 Rock. It's the centerpiece of Rockefeller Center, and that's where those guys are actually sitting. You can see you're looking north towards Central Park, and they're at Rockefeller Center. Bethlehem overnight became the go-to place for structural steel. Other people made structural steel, Carnegie, other companies, but no one else made the wide flange beam. So that's what put Bethlehem on the map with regard to structural steel. And they literally wrote the book. That's the Bethlehem Steel Structural Shape Book. It's the Bible of structural shapes. And for the entire history of the gray mill here in Bethlehem, which was in operation from 1908 to, I think, almost 1998, certainly 95 when the plant was silent. But Bethlehem became the go-to place in the world for structural steel. And Bethlehem Steel had all the best structural steel engineers that were embedded in all the major construction companies. And so that was the bread and butter of this company for many, many years. And a really differentiating factor was the wide flange beam that gave Bethlehem worldwide attention. Because now, those beams are used all over the world, and they're getting worldwide attention. Something needs to be said here at this point, too, about Schwab's strategy. Like I said, he was an industrial genius and was an innovator. But his strategy, which is not really a new strategy, was really based on vertical integration. And that was kind of all the buzz in the early 1900s as well. But he realized that he wasn't going to be able to build his own facilities. It's much better to grow by acquisition, by acquiring other facilities and modernizing the hell out of them. And then also looking upstream for all his raw materials to make sure that he acquired coal mines and iron ore mines and limestone quarries and all that, so they could control the entire process. Because at a steel plant, one thing that you absolutely need is predictability on your raw materials. You can't rely on others because you need that steady stream of good raw materials. And so every steel company in those days was looking at this vertical integration piece, and they were buying up a lot of those raw material properties. But Schwab also thought, I'm not only going to buy up the raw material properties, but I'm going to look downstream too and look at some of the companies that would be purchasing my products, purchase them, so that he would have a guaranteed outlet for the steel products coming out of the mill. So he looked at it really from the very beginning of the process, through the steelmaking process, on into the marketplace. And that was his strategy. And so he got going. This is, of course, now 1913. His first major acquisition was the Fore River Shipbuilding Corporation in Quincy, Massachusetts. Quincy, Fore River had a long history of shipbuilding, but they specialized in really large ships, battleships, cruisers, eventually aircraft carriers, cargo ships. and tankers. And that's kind of covered that end of the market, something that Bethlehem didn't have before Fall River. Became America's largest shipbuilder when they acquired Fall River. It's a position that Bethlehem held really for the next 50 years. Bethlehem divested of the Fall River shipyard in 1963. But that put Bethlehem on the map. And again, now we're talking about shipbuilding, becoming the largest shipbuilder in the country, taking a couple more steps up onto that stage. 1916, Bethlehem takes another huge step forward. This time, Schwab's looking at steel plants. He purchases the American Iron and Steel Manufacturing Company in Lebanon, PA. It was the largest nut and bolt production facility in the world. And also made rivets, which are important later to our story, and of course for ships, and made all sorts of industrial fasteners. It eventually became the industrial fastener division at Bethlehem Steel. It was in operation really until the 1980s. But it started out as American Iron and Steel, Lebanon. They had a plant in Reading as well. Also in 1916, Bethlehem acquires Pennsylvania Steel Company, another storied facility in the American steel industry, because the distinction of what became the Steelton plant, Steelton, PA, is that this is the first steel plant in America to be built from the ground up as a steel plant. Every other steel plant in the country at that point, before Steelton, including this one here in Bethlehem, started as an iron company first and then transitioned into steel. So this was like the ultra modern. This is the ultra modern steel company in 1876. I think. So and it was at Steelton, and so they were a big rail and rail product producer. And so Schwab acquired Steelton in 1916. Interestingly, too, it's kind of like a bookend. Not only did Bethlehem acquire the first steel plant in America, but Bethlehem also built the last steel plant in America to be built from the ground up as a steel plant in Burns Harbor, Indiana. And that, to this day, there's still not been another integrated steel plant built in the United States. And integrated means you start with raw materials, red dirt, black dirt, white dirt, coal, iron ore, limestone, put it into a blast furnace, make iron first, and then smelt and transform that iron into steel, and then roll it out into steel products. That's what they call an integrated steel plant. Burns Harbor is the last steel plant in America to be built as a steel plant in Indiana. And Bethlehem has that distinction of having the first and the last. And Burns Harbor is still a showplace of the industry. Also, they acquired the Maryland Steel Company, which was a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Steel Company. But the Maryland Steel Company, you'll know by the name Sparrows Point. That's the Sparrows Point plant of Bethlehem Steel. It came in the Pennsylvania Steel Company deal. It also included Bethlehem's first raw material properties, coal mines, iron ore mines, the Cornwall mines outside of in Lebanon and outside of Reading. Some of that interest came into the Bethlehem family in 1916, and the coal mines in West Virginia. Grace, he's still on his way up. By 1916, he's the president of Bethlehem Steel Corporation. He had been president of the Bethlehem Steel Company, and the way Bethlehem Steel worked in those days, the corporation was a holding company. And the main operating company was the Bethlehem Steel Company, which held the operations as part of its portfolio. Grace had become president of Bethlehem Steel Company in 1913, but in 1916 became president of Bethlehem Steel Corporation and held that position, or the chairman's position, for the next over almost 50 years. Grace, like I said, was an amazing guy too, but totally different than Charles Schwab. Grace was hard driving. He was abrupt. He was kind of a tough guy to work for. He was kind of an in-your-face kind of guy. He was old school management. That's how he ran things. But he was a genius in putting together the Bethlehem organization. But think about it. They're buying all these plants with different cultures and different management styles. And Grace was a master at putting the thing together and making it run as an efficient machine. And he was ruthlessly efficient. He was good at this. And he kind of created that whole Bethlehem mentality, something we used to call Bethlehemization. He kind of created that whole Bethlehemization idea where you work for Bethlehem Steel and there was a defined corporate culture. And it started really with Eugene Grace. I like to say what Schwab could dream, Grace could run. Schwab wasn't always into the daily, day-to-day operation. He was off doing the big deals and looking to the the innovations and looking for the new opportunities. Grace is always there behind the scenes every day running the operation. And he did that until 1957 when he went into retirement. He was honorary chairman, and he passed away in 1960. So really, Eugene Grace was a really major factor at Bethlehem Steel for 50 years. 1915, I think even the New York Times, I think, said it best, described Bethlehem Steel Corporation as possibly the most efficient, profitable, and self-contained steel plant in the country. That's the U.S. or that's the New York Times. Again, Bethlehem's starting to get noticed nationally, internationally, taking a couple more steps up onto that world stage. And then factor number 5. I can't tell you enough about World War I and how World War I profoundly impacted Bethlehem Steel in a very positive way. Now listen, wars are not good. And they call this one the Great War. Well, I can tell you, this was a great war for Bethlehem Steel. It came at just the right time. Schwab had started, investing in the wide flange beam, but they still had the ordnance capability, the heavy guns. World War I breaks out, and all of a sudden, overnight, there's this need for heavy guns again, projectiles, artillery pieces, and Bethlehem became really the arsenal of America. Now you hear that term a lot, the arsenal of democracy, the arsenal of America. Well, I can tell you that the Bethlehem's plant, this plant, really was the arsenal of America, especially in World War I. And its contribution to the fortune, or World War I's contribution to the fortune of Bethlehem Steel, you can't overstate it, because this became overnight almost practically the largest single steel plant in the country because of World War I and what was going on in Europe. And they made heavy guns. They made the whole artillery piece, caissons, the gun carriages, the gun itself, the projectiles, the ammunition, and Bethlehem even created a subsidiary called the Bethlehem Loading Company. They had a proving ground, and you saw some of the pictures here of down in Reddington, which doesn't really kind of exist anymore, but down along the Lehigh River, just downriver towards Easton, by Steel City, they had a total munitions complex. They had a proving ground where they fired cannons into the side of the mountain. They had shell loading capabilities there. Bethlehem even built what was going to be the largest proving ground in the world outside of Mays Landing in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. Built a town there called Belcoville, New Jersey. Now, Belcoville doesn't really exist anymore, but it was an acronym: Bethlehem, BE, Loading, OO, Belco Company, Belcoville, New Jersey. And they had a shell munitions plant there. It wasn't fully built because the war ended, a year later. But they also had another munitions plant in Newcastle, Delaware. So Bethlehem was just huge in World War I, and it was a financial bonanza for Bethlehem. Interesting story. Before America was in the war, Schwab was invited to go to Britain by Winston Churchill, who was then Lord of the Admiralty, and he met with all the top. There is actually Winston. He met with all the top Navy admirals in Great Britain, and they said, Schwab, can you give us 20 submarines? 20 submarines in 9 months. Schwab said, sure, I can do it. So he came home. It's a little problem with neutrality. Bethlehem or the United States wasn't in the war yet, so building submarines and sending them to Great Britain just kind of was not a real good idea. Schwab was undeterred. He went back to London. They said, Schwab, are you going to be able to give us the submarines? He said, well, no, and they became furious, but he said, I have a solution. What they did was, and this was Schwab's idea, built all the pieces to the submarine, manufactured the pieces in Bethlehem Steel's shipyards, shipped them up to Montreal, Canada, and assembled them in the Vickers shipyard of Montreal to get around the neutrality laws. And of course, Canada was a dominion of Great Britain those days, so the British were all too happy to give them the Vickers shipyard, and they assembled the 20 submarines and got them there in 9 months. And so Schwab became a hero in Great Britain because he came to the aid of Britain before the United States was in the war and before the United States was a belligerent. And it's just an amazing story. During World War I, because of Bethlehem Steel shipbuilding capability, Schwab was appointed the Director General of the United States Emergency Fleet Corporation, and he was appointed by President Woodrow Wilson. And there he is, looking over shipping and shipbuilding matters. And he actually kind of took a leave of absence from Bethlehem. Of course, he had grace work in Bethlehem anyway. But during World War I, Schwab was in charge of the U.S. shipbuilding, which, of course, Bethlehem was a major part of. But there's the record. 60% of all the finished guns for the United States, Bethlehem produced here at the Bethlehem plant. 65% of all gun forges. 40% of all U.S. artillery ammunition. 65% of all Allied artillery pieces. And I'm talking about the whole system. The caissons, the shot, the shell, the gun barrels, everything. Over 18 million rounds of ammunition for the field guns. They also, at the same time, produced 22% of all the merchant shipping and 50% of destroyer production in the United States. A staggering amount. David Lloyd George, who was the prime minister in those days in Great Britain, said in 1923, Charles Schwab was the first American to help us. He gave us the necessary equipment to continue the war to a successful ending for the Allies. And so Schwab endeared himself to Britain ever since World War I. And the World War I record really was, financially, was just phenomenal. Of course, a lot of the material came out of the number 2 machine shop, which is just that way. And that's what the number 2 machine shop looked like, that full tilt. Just an amazing operation. Largest building under roof in the world at the time it was built. And so what that provided was a huge financial windfall that Schwab immediately started putting to work. And so World War I gave Bethlehem the opportunity to take a few more really big steps forward. 1922, Schwab invested in the Lackawanna Steel Company in Lackawanna, New York. It's outside of Buffalo. It was important because it's on Lake Erie, and it gave Bethlehem access to the Midwest steel market for the first time. 1923, Midville Steel and Ordnance and the Cambria Steel Company, that's the Johnstown plant with Bethlehem Steel. It also included a Coatesville plant, which Bethlehem operated for a time and then got rid of, but eventually got back in 1998 when Bethlehem Steel bought the Lucan Steel Company. Now Bethlehem is the second largest steelmaker in the country, which it occupied that position really almost just about to the very end. They also expanded their ship repair capability, acquired the Key Highway Yard and the Fort McHenry Yard in the Air Harbor of Baltimore. If you go there today, you can still see where the shipyard used to be. It's now, I think, condos or apartments or something, but and the Fort McHenry Yard. So that gave Bethlehem three shipyards in the Baltimore area, including Sparrows Point. And for many, many years, Bethlehem Steel was the largest private employer in the state of Maryland because of the Sparrows Point plant, the shipyard, and these 2 shipyards. 1922, they acquired the Simpson Dry Dock Company in East Boston. 1924, San Pedro, California, which is, they call it Los Angeles Harbor. It's on Terminal Island in the Port of Los Angeles. And emblematic of this whole period is Bethlehem's growing capability, really. I chose this slide to kind of talk about shipbuilding in the 1920s because Bethlehem built America's first aircraft carrier, the USS Lexington. Lexington its hull started out as a battle cruiser, but because of treaty restrictions, they converted it to an aircraft carrier. But it's the first aircraft carrier, basically purpose-built as an aircraft carrier. 1925, in Fall River, Massachusetts. They called it the Lady Lex. Unfortunately, she met her demise in 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. And went into history. But that's emblematic of what Bethlehem's capability was now. Had that distinction. And built many, many other carriers as we went forward. They also we're doing some other things. Created the loop management course. I'm a looper. There could be some other loopers in the crowd here tonight. The loop management course is one of America's first management training courses. It was kind of world famous, and 1922 started. Ed Martin, who eventually became chairman. Of course, we all know Martin Tower. He was a member of that first loop class in 1922. 1924, Bethlehem started the Bethlehem Review. Again, a forerunner in American industry, one of the first magazines for employees in American industry. And I had the real honor of being the last editor of the Bethlehem Review. And that's one of my creations there on the left with Hank Barnett and Tony Dunn. And of course, Schwab at this point is at the pinnacle of his notoriety, his capability. Hits the cover of Time magazine, looks like 1926, and Bethlehem Steel is taking a few more steps up onto that world stage for sure. That brings us to the last factor. Acquisition of McClintock Marshall and the Fabricated Steel Construction Division. McClintock Marshall, interesting, had a lot of tie-ins, but here at Lehigh University, if you go up on campus, you'll see the McClintock Marshall dormitory. McClintock and Marshall were both Lehigh graduates. They went off and started their own construction company in Pittsburgh and became fabulously successful at building bridges and major structures. So successful that by 1930-31, Bethlehem decided, again, Schwab, Grace, thought, okay, we're making wide flange beams, we're making the pieces anyway, why don't we actually build the buildings? Okay, again, thinking about that downstream thing. I also want to point out one important distinction here that a lot of people miss. When people talk about some of the major structures that Bethlehem Steel built, like the Golden Gate Bridge, they say, oh, Bethlehem provided the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge, or they provided the steel for the U.S. Supreme Court building, or whatever. That's true, but there's three phases of steel construction. There's the steel production, which of course Bethlehem did. There's the steel fabrication, where you put the pieces together before you take them to the job site, which McClintock Marshall and Bethlehem had been doing too. And then there's the erection and the construction of the actual structure itself. Bethlehem did all three. When they acquired McClintock Marshall, gave them that whole capability. So some projects, they did everything from soup to nuts, producing the steel, fabricating the pieces, and erecting the building. And the Golden Gate Bridge was one of those. Bethlehem did it all. So it was more than just supplying the steel. And there's a great story, typical of Eugene Grace. He went out to California for the dedication of the bridge. It's a beautiful structure. He was standing there with one of the construction foremen or supervisors. And Grace said to him, hey, isn't this great what Bethlehem Steel did here? And the foreman looked at him and said, what are you talking about Bethlehem Steel? That was McClintock Marshall. Well, the next day, Grace went back to Bethlehem, and McClintock Marshall ceased to exist for the rest of his history. It became Bethlehem Steel Fabricated Steel Construction Division. And that's why if you see pictures of a lot of the Bethlehem projects, every beam is Bethlehem. And so they actually let McClintock Marshall operate as its own entity for a while until the Golden Gate Bridge, and then Grace put it into it. Became the largest fabricator in the world, and did such great projects as, of course, the Golden Gate Bridge, which I think is a signature project. It's the one that everybody talks about. It's probably the most, iconic landmark maybe in the United States when you think about iconic structures. The George Washington Bridge, the Waldorf Astoria, the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. That's the largest office building in the world until they built the Pentagon. Rockefeller Plaza, of course, there's the GE building, there's the lunch atop the skyscraper. U.S. Supreme Court building. And many, many more. I could go on and on. I have a list in my office of all the Bethlehem projects, and there's hardly a project at all in the United States that Bethlehem didn't touch in some way on one of those three phases of steel. They rounded out their shipbuilding and ship repair capability in 1938, acquired two shipyards in Brooklyn, 56th Street Shipyard and 27th Street Shipyard. They also acquired a facility in Staten Island, New York, a shipyard and a propeller shop, and a lot of the Bethlehem Steel shipyards too. I didn't mention before, but not only did they build ships, but they repaired ships and they converted ships, and they built all the components there too. So, marine turbines and engines and all the components for the ship they typically built at the shipyards, including propellers. Hoboken, New Jersey, right across from Manhattan. Bethlehem had a shipyard there. Acquired that in 1938. 1939, Schwab passes away. Sadly, dies penniless, broke. Eugene Grace takes over. And so it's Grace's company, for sure, starting in 1939. There they are. You can see, of course, Schwab was chairman from 1905 to 39. He had been president before Grace became president in 16. Grace was president all the way until 1957. Chairman from 45 to 57, became honorary chairman 57 to 60, and passed away in 1960. Mark Homer, the director of Bethlehem Steel's shipbuilding activities, became the third chairman. And World War II takes place. And, you know, I debated about whether I would consider World War II kind of the seventh factor that got Bethlehem Steel on the world stage. But I really think that, in my estimation, World War II is more of a culmination of what had happened up until that point. All the pieces were in place. Because of those six factors before World War II, Bethlehem was in position to just really flourish and come into its own in World War II. And the Bethlehem record in World War II was just staggering in different ways than World War I in some respects, but mostly in the area of shipbuilding. Of course, at this point, they're making 16-inch guns for the battleships here in Bethlehem. That's the battleship Massachusetts, the one battleship that Bethlehem built during the Second World War. The Fairfield shipyard, where they made Liberty ships, just an enormous facility. And the interesting thing about Fairfield is that all the Bethlehem Steel facilities in World War II, those 300,000 employees, Fairfield was the single largest employment site in Bethlehem Steel history. 45,000 employees, bigger than all the steel plants. And they made Liberty ships there, 384 Liberty ships, including the first one, the Patrick Henry. It was the single largest Liberty ship producer in the country, single site. Henry Kaiser out on the West Coast actually built more Liberty ships. But as far as a single site, Bethlehem's Fairfield shipyard was the largest. And there, I love this graphic. This is what we call the bridge of ships. This is actually a graphic representation of every ship that Bethlehem built in World War II, and they're all there. And they tell you what classes of ships. They have the 5 Essex-class aircraft carriers, the 1 battleship, many cruisers, dozens of destroyers, everything on down to tugboats, LSTs, landing craft, you name it. 1,121 ships. By far the largest, most diverse shipbuilding program in the history of the world. And there'll never be another one like it, because we don't fight wars like that anymore. We don't build lots of ships. So Bethlehem, not only was the largest shipbuilder in the world, but conducted the largest shipbuilding program that mankind has ever done and ever will do. I don't think we'll ever need 1,121 ships. And there they all are. And there's a graphic artist that drew every one of those. That's not a photograph. He drew those. Amazing. And Eugene Grace said, I'm going to promise a ship a day. A ship a day during World War II. By 1943, he did it and surpassed it easily by 380 ships. So he passed it by 15 ships. And we're not talking about just little ships. We're talking about major ships. So some of them are there. We have a destroyer, a troop ship, ammunition tender, aircraft carrier. That's the Massachusetts. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's the heavy cruiser Baltimore. And that's the Massachusetts under construction Fort River. And these are major ships. But a ship a day in 1943, just amazing. The Liberty fleet I already talked about was a major contribution with Bethlehem Steel. And the Liberty ship is kind of the unsung hero of World War II. Without those auxiliary ships to move cargo and move material all around the world, you don't win a war. Yeah, everybody knows about the aircraft carriers and the battleships, but you need a lot of those kind of ships. And the United States built a lot of those kind of ships, and Bethlehem built 384. So, just to recap, by World War II, Bethlehem is on that world stage. They're just, they started as a single plant here along the Lehigh. Because of those 6 factors and the slow progression of time, and through the genius of Charles Schwab, they arrived there, certainly by 1945. John Fritz set out the table for Schwab. Was the genius that decided we need to move this plant into heavy forgings, ordnance, and helped create that niche for the Bethlehem Iron Company that got Schwab's attention, so that Schwab could invest in Bethlehem and make it the company that it was. Number 3, shipbuilding. Again, the differentiation, the mission differentiation that sets Bethlehem apart from any other steel maker in the country, and even in the world. The wide flange beam. Schwab gambles the company on the wide flange beam, and it works. It transforms Bethlehem into the world power, if you will, structural steel. That's a doorknob from Martin Tower. And it's sad. I was up on the 17th floor in one of those corner offices that you keep hearing about, and it was gorgeous. But the great thing about it for me, I faced southwest. I could look down, and I grew up next to Richmond Junior High School, or Richmond Middle School, and so I could look out of my office, look down into the yard where I grew up from my office in Martin Tower, all gone. Number 5, World War I, a great war for Bethlehem Steel, a bonanza financially, one which Schwab very carefully and wisely invested in all his other facilities in the 1920s. And of course, fabricated steel construction rounded out Bethlehem's portfolio and allowed it to participate in some of the real landmark and iconic projects around the country. So those are the 6 factors, in my opinion, that allowed this single plant to become the industrial behemoth that it is today. And like I said, Bethlehem, it's a great company. It's a company that changed families, changed communities, literally changed the landscape of this country and the world. It made that world a safer place through the winning of 2 world wars, especially the efforts of Bethlehem Steel in the Second World War with their shipbuilding program. A great story, and a story that really needs to be celebrated today. So that's it.